There's a neighborhood in Atlanta called Cabbagetown. It's kind of a bohemian neighborhood of homes, murals, cafes, and shops. A few stories are told about how it got its name, Cabbagetown, like how many of the residents who were Scots-Irish in the early 20th century grew and cooked cabbage. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about a little bit of, history. The apartment lofts right in back of me are on the National Register of Historic Places. You see, that building was the site of the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was the largest employer in the city of Atlanta. And the neighboring Cabbagetown was built as, housing for its employees. I'm Audrey Galix, Community Engagement Director for AIB Network, and we are honored to partner with the Bremen Museum to bring you these stories of success and loss, as well as benevolence and community. They're part of the History with Chutzpah exhibit, remarkable stories from the Southern Jewish adventure, 1733 through the present. So you want to talk about chutzpah. And don't forget, chutzpah is Yiddish for guts or moxie. It's the early 20th century. Imagine you're fresh off the boat from Eastern Europe, and you hear there's economic opportunity down south. Maybe you become a peddler like Felix Shavinsky, whose photo is in the exhibit. Chances are, as he walked from town to town from his home in Birmingham, Alabama, he discovered the streets weren't exactly paved with gold, but with opportunity. Sandy Berman and Jane Levy co-curated the History with Chutzpah exhibit and observed that peddling gave these immigrants a foothold in the community.
Once you start peddling, you can maybe get you're a foot peddler initially, and then maybe you can get a horse. Maybe then you can get a wagon, and then maybe you can open a store. And even Rich's here in Atlanta started out that way.
Rich's department store opened in 1867 as a dry goods store. In 1924, it moved to the corner of Alabama and Broad Street, and for more than a century, it was the place to shop in downtown Atlanta. But more on its place in the History with Chutzpah exhibit a little later on in the program. Isidore Straus, who would one day become the owner of Macy's department store in New York, also started out as a peddler in Talbotton, Georgia. Hard to believe the dignified man you see in this portrait had such humble beginnings. Sadly, he and his wife Ida are remembered as the loving couple in the Titanic movie. Both died together when the ship sank. Back in Atlanta, one can only imagine the cacophony of sound inside Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills, with hundreds of spindles turning and hundreds of employees, like many mills across the South. A flour bag and the weaving shuttle and sewing machine that may have constructed the bag are in the exhibit. The mill's owner, Jacob Elsass, was a German immigrant, one of many Jewish business owners who left their mark on the South. The mill was officially incorporated in 1889 and functioned until 1978. First-hand accounts tell us that the roots of this long-lasting company were laid down by a kind yet firm hand. An anecdote about taking the streetcar to the mill was offered up in an interview conducted in 1970 with Sinclair Jacobs, son of the owner of Jacobs Pharmacy, which you'll hear about in a moment.
And Mr. Jacob Elsass was very nice, but he was hardball when it came to business. He didn't think that any son of his should have an automobile, to ride out on a streetcar. Sometimes on the south side they were drawn by mules, but then it was streetcars, and they had to go to the center of town and transfer out to Decatur Street and be at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mills at 7:30. And if they weren't at 7:30, he'd pull out his watch and say, "You're late." It could have been 2 minutes late.
Although those who knew him personally recount his kindness, not all of his employees felt that generosity. In 1914, the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill was the site of the first major organized labor protest in the southern United States. The strike ultimately failed, but demonstrated the power of the union worker. Elsass also played an important role in the founding of the Georgia Institute of Technology and enrolled his son Oscar in the school. And when Elsass died in 1931, he had one request, as Sandy Berman, the co-curator of the exhibit, explains.
Jacob Elsass is buried right across the street at Oakland Cemetery in a mausoleum that has a window. Because when he died, he said he always wanted to be able to look down upon the factory. And if you go into Oakland, you can go by the mausoleum, and there's a little window in the mausoleum, and staring right down at Fulton Bag.
Sinclair Jacobs, who spoke of the nature of Jacob Elsass, was himself part of an Atlanta Jewish institution. His father, Joseph Jacobs, owned a pharmacy and famous soda fountain right here at downtown Atlanta at a crossroads known as 5 Points. It was at one time the largest pharmacy chain in the state of Georgia. Notably, Jacobs Pharmacy was the first establishment to sell a glass of a new specialty drink tonic made from the cola nut, aptly named Coca-Cola. A dip pen, medicine bottle, and a pencil are among the artifacts that tell the story of Joseph Jacobs. As a young man, Jacobs was an apprentice to Dr. Crawford Long, himself honored with a stamp as the first physician to use ether as an anesthetic. Ironically, in 1929, Jacobs wrote an article entitled, "How I Won and Lost an Interest in Coca-Cola." He wrote, "After disposing of my Coca-Cola stock to Mr. Candler, I never owned any more of it, which evidences my poor judgment. Asa Candler was a fellow druggist who wanted out of the pharmacy business. Candler went on to take control of the Coca-Cola company. And the rest, as they say, is soft drink and Atlanta history." At the History with Chutzpah exhibit, you can't miss the Montag brothers' mechanical blue horse. And if you grew up in Atlanta, you probably knew all about it as well. The horse and other objects tell the story of a company founded in Atlanta in 1889 by Sigmund Montag and his 4 brothers. It manufactured writing tablets. In 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression, salesman Sam Sugarman came up with a campaign to boost sales by making the covers and filler bands redeemable for a prize. The giveaways included watches and pocket knives, and at one time a pony and a bike. A chain gang uniform tells the story of the Perfect Pants Manufacturing Company in Fitzgerald, Georgia. And if you're looking for chaps, well, Annie Oakley, Will Rogers, and the Lone Ranger would have felt right at home at Goodman's in Waycross. There are photos and cutouts from the store in the exhibit. They tell the story of a shopkeeper with a lot of chutzpah.
The owner of Goodman's was a man by the name of Sam I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Yermavowski. And when he was peddling, again, started out as a peddler, he would often give the children he passed a penny. And people would say, "There goes a good man." And so when he opened his Western wear store, he decided to name it Goodman's, because there went a good man. It's a great story.
A plastic brassiere form is fitting to tell the story of a company with a lovable name.
So Lovable Brassiere was founded in 1926 by Frank and Gussie Gottesman. They changed their name to Garson at some point in time. I think Gottesman must have been hard to pronounce. And it started out as this small little brassiere manufacturer and became really one of the largest brassiere manufacturers in the world. It became an international company.
A photo in the exhibit illustrates how, as early as the 1930s, Lovable Brassiere had a racially integrated workforce. But eventually, Lovable Brassiere couldn't compete. It folded in 1998. It was the nasty boll weevil that got the best of one Lewis Cohen, even though he was, at one time, revered in the town of Sandersville, Georgia.
Somebody said once they should have named the town Coneville for how prominent and important he was to Sandersville. He brought the short line railroad to Sandersville, and he opened a bank. It was called the Banking House of Lewis Cone.
He must have adored his family, too. Letterhead from his bank sported the pictures of his grandchildren. But when the boll weevil decimated the cotton crop in 1915 and farmers went broke, Cohen's banking days were numbered.
They had all this, they were all this credit to the banks, and most of the banks also went under, did not pay back the creditors. Louis Cohn paid every single person back, and by 1917 had to go out of business himself because of that. So he's just was a really important figure in the town of Sandersville.
A well-traveled salesman's sample case represents the Steiner Loebman Company in Montgomery, Alabama.
They were dry goods. They manufactured overalls and short little ones called polyols, and they were successful for a very, very long time. But as the founder's granddaughter once said, Walmart came in, and that's what happened to most of these businesses. It was the Walmarts taking over, and they just couldn't compete.
The exhibit speaks of the many factors that played into the shuttering of those family-owned businesses, like economic and educational opportunities elsewhere. And with those, the Jewish population shifted away from small towns in the South. Once thriving businesses had no one to run them, and the synagogues and other Jewish institutions the community supported could no longer function as they once did. In the exhibit, you'll see images and memorabilia from congregations that no longer exist. The 1949 confirmation class from Temple Beth El in Dalton, Georgia, and a confirmation class from 1890 at Temple B'nai Jeshurun, founded in Demopolis, Alabama in 1858. The congregation closed in 1989, and in 2012, Sandy Berman tracked down the last Jewish person in town.
And we went to Demopolis, and we got lost. Our GPS wasn't working because of where we were. And we go into this little cafe, and we sat down and had something to drink. We were early for our appointment, but we just didn't know where he lived. And I turned to the table next to us. There were 3 men sitting there, and I go, by chance, do you know where Bert Rosenbusch lives? And one of the men said, you looking for old Bert? Well, he lives on Bert Rosenbusch Road. And so the street was named for Bert. They told us where to go, and he was the last Jewish person to live in Demopolis.
His 2012 interview sheds light on how his grandparents put down roots in Demopolis in 1895.
And he was a very successful merchant. He had a chain of stores in this area, and he also had a funeral home along with the furniture store. And he had a cemetery that he would bury his people in that didn't have a plot to bury their loved ones.
A lamp from one of the hearses from the family funeral home business is in the exhibit. Stories of success and loss can also be told about the Jewish-owned and operated mom-and-pop grocery stores, many of those in Atlanta owned by Holocaust survivors. Today, only a handful remain, and the exhibit showcases a number of photos and objects that tell the story. Sadly, a collage of newspaper headlines explains why many closed shop. Yet evidence remains of days gone by.
And you can still see the facades. If you go to some of these communities, you can see the old names on some of the buildings. I love that in my travels throughout Georgia and Alabama, to see where the signs were and to see what the stores had once looked like. And a couple of them were still sort of around. Dannenberg's in Macon was a big old department store. It was established in 1867, which is the same year as Rich's. And Dannenberg, it was closed, but Mr. Dannenberg, Walter Dannenberg, he had a little office in the store and allowed us to come in and root around to take what we could that would, he had a vault, and we found all of his old business records. It was quite a find for us. So he gave us all of the old business records and some other items from the store.
And talk about chutzpah.
When it came time to integrate the store, he was very involved, and he and some other business leaders, as well as the black community leaders of Macon, they all got together and they decided how they would integrate his soda fountain and other soda fountains peacefully. And they just did it peacefully and quietly. One day they just had somebody sitting at the soda fountain, and then the next day they had a couple more people. And instead of the horrible confrontations that happened in other areas in the South, Macon integrated much more peacefully. And it was because the community leaders wanted it to be so.
From hair care to shoe repair, from lollipops to the mom and pop stores that sold them, no matter whether they closed for good or got swallowed up by a bigger fish, these Jewish-owned enterprises and the men and women who ran them had what it took to make a go of it. They had chutzpah. Providing for one's family and creating a nest egg for future generations has certainly been a value deep in the heart of the Southern Jewish ethos. And so has the concept of what's known in the Jewish soul as tikkun olam, repairing the world, and tzedakah, the religious obligation to do what is right, including helping those in need. Both are reflected in the History with Chutzpah exhibit in the section known as Benevolence and Community.
It's what our Jewish community and Jewish communities throughout history have always done. They have always given back, not just to their own, but to the communities in which they have lived. And Atlanta was no different.
This Grady Hospital administrative building in downtown Atlanta tells a story of benevolence and community that's actually hidden in plain sight. Notice the name on the building, one Albert Steiner. It wouldn't be a big surprise if you've never heard of him.
And I guarantee you, because I did it, if you walk through that building, no one knows who Albert Steiner is. But the building is named the Steiner Building. It's emblazoned across the front.
And why, you ask, does this building bear his name? You see, Albert Steiner was the beloved president of the Atlanta Ice and Brewing Company. In fact, his employees named a beer after him. Unfortunately, Steiner also faced tragedy.
His wife and son both died of cancer. And then in 1919, he was also dying of cancer. So he bequeathed to Grady Hospital $500,000, a sizable amount in 1919. We have estimated that today's money, it would be about $10 million to Grady Hospital to establish a cancer clinic.
And though the cancer clinic has moved, Steiner's legacy lives on.
And at the time, the newspaper, the Constitution, reported it was the largest gift the city has ever seen for the relief of the suffering of humanity.
Another Atlanta legend came in the form of an iconic department store, Rich's. You can just imagine the generations of Atlantans who met under the awning at Rich's flagship store in downtown Atlanta. It was also well known for its commitment to the community from its earliest days. Rich's was an Atlanta institution for 138 years. In 1895, the Rich brothers helped bail out the Cotton States and International Exposition, which took place on the grounds of today's Piedmont Park. Among other charitable contributions, they paid off teachers' salaries in 1930 when the city was short on funds, and they paid a detachment of troops based at Fort McPherson in 1945, the Sunday before Labor Day, when the fort's vault was locked.
The Rich brothers and their descendants always gave back to the community. They were involved in every aspect of benevolence. They helped their workers. They helped the community through philanthropic giving. They helped with the arts. They developed a foundation called the Rich Foundation, which has continuously given back to, even now, to philanthropic, to museums and causes in the city of Atlanta. They gave out during the Depression, they gave out scrip so that are printed their own money so that people could still shop at Rich's.
Check out the woman's suit and metal charge card and case from the 1930s that are in the exhibit. A photo of Lewis and his son Isidore Pizitz tells the story of a dry goods store that became a chain of 13 stores across Alabama. Never forgetting his humble roots, Pizitz was known for his generosity, even sending trucks of food to striking coal miners in 1908 and 1930. Next, consider the collective community involvement and chutzpah of the people like Irwin Zabin behind National Service Industries,
which include Atlanta Linen and Supply, which was really the first business, and then Zepp Chemical, Sela Chemical, Lithonia Lighting, Block Industries, and Atlantic Envelope. All of those businesses merged to form National Service Industries.
Several items in the exhibit illustrate the company's laundry list of philanthropic endeavors.
From the Zabin Night Shelter to Zabin Park, which is part of the Marcus, where the Marcus Community Center is now. That's all on land that was given to the Jewish community by the Zabin family. Atlantic Linen, the Weinberg family has done so much. The Holocaust Education Department of the Bremen Museum is funded by the Weinberg family, as the Weinstein Center is funded by the founders of the Atlantic Linen Company.
And it won't surprise you to see the name Bremen among those who demonstrated chutzpah through their charitable giving.
We wanted to include Bill Bremen for a variety of reasons. This museum wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for William Bremen, who decided that it was important for Atlanta to have a Jewish museum, and who gave us the initial funding for this museum. He owned Bremen Steel, which was a major steel manufacturing company here in Atlanta, and was also founder of the Bremen Jewish Home. So there were so many aspects of benevolence that Bill Bremen did, and his legacy lives on because of all of the charitable contributions that he made that have really enhanced how the Jewish community lives today. And I think that he's just a person that needs to be remembered.
Not only did Bill Bremen support the community financially, he also donated his time. Bill Bremen's contributions illustrate the larger cultural identity that exists at the crossroads of Judaism and Southern hospitality. It's tradition.
When we talk about benevolence and community, and we ask, what is it about that makes you want to give back to your community? All of our memorists and everyone we interviewed all spoke to the fact that it was a family tradition, that it was instilled in them in a young age to give charity, and that's a Jewish concept, to be charitable and to give back.
To that end, a selection of civic-minded mothers and daughters are showcased in the exhibit. A few from more than a century ago, seen here Rhoda Kaufman and her sister Bernice, advocates for child welfare. And in more recent times, women like Sherry Frank, Gail Evans, and Janice Rothschild, who demonstrated chutzpah by their involvement in civil rights and getting the story right. Sherry Frank's Life magazine, signed by the late Congressman John Lewis, and a small flag from the very first Martin Luther King Jr. holiday are featured in the exhibit. A portrait of Sam Massell, Atlanta's first Jewish mayor, elected in 1969, also hangs in the exhibit. In an oral history interview with Sandy Berman, Massell admitted he wasn't a good student, but he apparently had chutzpah.
Incidentally, my high school principal, Hayden C. Brown, I'll never forget because he'd never forget me. And the last week of school, in fact, he stood there and shook his long, thin finger at me and said, "Buddy," I was known as Buddy then. He said, "Buddy, you'll never amount to anything." And I probably earned that. And maybe that was just a challenge I needed, I know sometimes you don't know what motivates you.
Asher Benader may have been a Golden Gloves boxing champ in 1949, but he's known for having a hand in supporting a number of communal institutions that helped him and his family succeed, like the Jewish Community Center and its early childhood programs. And it had to take chutzpah to spotlight your hometown on Broadway. Playwright Alfred Urey is also featured in the Benevolence and Community section of the exhibit. He captured the spirit of Jewish Atlanta with Driving Miss Daisy and The Last Night of Ballyhoo. He also brought the story of Leo Frank to Broadway in the Tony Award-winning musical, Parade. After listening to these stories of success and loss, of benevolence and community, well, maybe it's reminded you of stories from your own family history. At the very least, we hope you've been inspired to come and visit the Bremen. But I would like to offer this challenge. If you're lucky enough to have photos and other memorabilia, why don't you take a look through them? Put your feet in the shoes of some of the people in your own family tree. I'll just bet you might find stories that, well, give you a sense of roots and of possibilities. Stories of your own personal history with Chutzpah.